So my novella is called Coup de Grace, and it is a story about a man named Vicken who lives in Montreal, and he's decided to take the subway to the end of the line where he's going to get off and then walk into the St. Lawrence River and drown himself. Um, but before he's able to do that, he gets off at a station that does not exist. And it is not the end of the line, and it has no exits and no doors and no windows. And it seems to be expanding and refracting off of itself. And so Coup de Glace is about his experience of trying to find his way through this liminal space and see if he can get out. And it is a book about depression and being in a liminal state and whether or not depression can be seen as a liminal state. And any more than that would be a spoiler.
One thing I'll say before actually starting out the conversation and asking you questions and putting you on the spot is that there is some sensitive situations that happen in this book. And so to my listeners, I want you to know that I take this seriously. And if I say something wrong or use the wrong words or something like that, it's not that I don't care. It's just that I don't sometimes know how to use all the right words. So if I say something that catches you the wrong way, apologies in advance. But I do take the serious stuff seriously. So please just bear that in mind, I guess, is the way that I want to start that out. Because, there is the main idea of the story is it's about a person who has chosen to end their life. And so I don't think that there's a way to have this conversation where that's not part of it. And so I just want to get out up front. I don't intend to, offend anybody by anything I say or make them think that I take it lightly, because I don't. But I also do want to have fun in this conversation. So we'll be respectful and hopefully light as well a little bit too, when it's appropriate for that stuff. So I was thinking about that. I went and got myself some coffee before I came. Yeah, right on. And I was like, okay, I have to make some kind of acknowledgement because I know that I have the capacity to put my foot in my mouth. And on the walk there, I had the perfect speech about how to just say it quickly and succinctly. And then when I got done thinking about it, I was like, that's not how it's going to sound. And it wasn't. So the thought that I had was perfect, but this is what you guys get. That being said, I guess I will give you, Sophia, an opportunity to talk about stuff. Before we get into talking about the plot and everything like that, one of the things that I'm usually pretty terrible about, but I want to acknowledge definitely with this, and if you're watching the YouTube, you'll see it, is the cover is beautiful. I love the cover. And so there it is. Sophia's holding it up. So let's talk about that first. What was that like? I know sometimes an author will have covers foisted on them. Other times they'll have creative kind of input and everything. So what was your experience?
It was like a long one, and I feel so grateful and also like apologetic towards my editor who got just like the brunt force of my graphic design hyperfixation. Because when I was in college, I studied in graphic design, and I was like, as my day job, I'm a jewelry designer. And so design and aesthetic is like a really important part of a lot of what I do. And so I was like, not that I don't trust you guys, but I just want to make sure that I provide as much information as possible. And I did. I made this like 16-page document. It was like excessively long.
Wow.
And it was everything from like, here's the mood board. Here's 3 different directions I think we should go in. Here's like typography treatments. Here's competitors like in the industry with similar book covers, or like, it was just over the top. But I wanted to make sure that like, no matter what happened, I felt like I had like washed my hands of it. And it went through a lot of iterations. Like, it was a really interesting process because all of the other covers that I've worked on, I've either done myself. So like Bury Your Gaze, which I edited with
Mm-hmm.
Ghoulish, I had done the covers of, and then I had a novella come out with Crystal Lake Publishing, and then it was part of a series. So like the cover had to go with
Uh,
the
yeah.
rest of their series. And then this was the first time that like I sort of had a little bit of input, but I also had almost no control over it. And it was really cool to see the process because they'll show you a couple of different iterations, and then you're like, this one looks really good. But then they take it to marketing, and then marketing says, oh, this doesn't pull well. It doesn't look good as a thumbnail. It's like illegible
Uh-huh.
as a thumbnail. So there's like a lot of back and forthing. And yeah, I'm so happy with it. I feel like it really like, I don't know, represents the sort of liminal brutalist aesthetic. And then I was excited to
Mhm.
see that they, ooh, that was a really large crack. It has like
Oh, nice.
10 pages, which is really nice. Oh yeah, because you have like the paperback one.
I
So
have the yeah. I've got the arc, so I don't see
yeah,
all the.
she's not fully adorned yet, but it's cool. There's like little like recessed doorways and
Oh,
things.
nice.
I like it.
I should have picked up on because I think you were the one when I first posted that I had a print arc of Stephen Graham Jones. I was a teenage slasher. I think that you just commented that spot gloss or something like that,
Love
and
it.
I should have put two and two together that maybe you did have more of like an eye for design. You had said that you had this 16-page thing and lots of input and ideas and everything. What was the publisher's response to like your level of involvement? Are they kind of used to that, or was it like, what's this person?
I don't know really, because my point of contact was my editor, and I really didn't want to overload him because my understanding of what an editor does is they acquire and then they'll help you edit the manuscript. And Daniel Carpenter, who was my editor for this project at Titan, was so much more hands on with me, um, really down to the details, which like it meant so much to me as a sort of um, like emerging author. I haven't really
Mm,
had much experience in traditional publishing, but everything from even the interior, where it was like, what do I want the drop caps to look like?
hmm.
How many of the words on the first sentence will be capitalized?
Oh,
And
cool.
then it really gets you thinking. And I was going through all these different books that I have, and it does lend a different aesthetic tone to it, depending on what it looks like. Um, and I do think that there are some books where the interior, I think, is like thoughtlessly designed
Hmm.
in a way, where it makes the reading experience like not very good. I recently bought this paperback version of a book that's only out in hardcover. I don't know why I thought that like for some reason the paperback was out. It wasn't. It was a like large print version.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and so it's this like enormous font. And I was like, this is not the reading experience I want to be having.
Yeah.
I kept it. I am like annotating it, which is fun because there's so much room. Um, but yeah, there's so much design work that goes into making a book that I got to see that I'd never really seen before.
That's interesting, and I'm sure it's different um, with kind of more traditional publishing than it is with indies. I think maybe in both directions because sometimes indies might not have the bandwidth to think that much about it, but other times they might want to get more experimental with it. Um, but yeah, with traditional, I have to imagine that they probably have a little bit more of a like a series of processes that they run things
Yeah,
through to make sure that they're ready to go and stuff. Yeah.
it's so it was like such a strange and like enlightening experience because in the document that I had created, this like master doc, I was like I had created a page that was like aesthetic direction Sofia does not like prefer the author prefers we don't go into. And it was like very generic or I guess liminal space can sometimes look almost futuristic. And I was like, I don't want the
Mm,
Blade Runner style stuff. I don't want like a corridor where a subway is emerging, like something that evokes nothing. And so I was like putting all these examples. Um, but then some of the iterations that end up coming back from the design team, like the early iterations, are like do contain those things because that's what sells, and like it's a
yeah.
quicker visual language than we can even like comprehend. But I was like, no, I don't want it to look like a airport read. So I had a lot of back and forthing with my editor to the point where I was like, I'm so sorry. Just one more little thing. If we can just change this one little thing, I'll stop emailing you. Um, Down to like the fonts, the colors. Yeah, I wish I could like share the iterations. I'm like, I'm not allowed to, but it
Yeah.
went through like a surprising amount of them. It was a really cool process to see.
Yeah. Well, you brought up actually something I hadn't thought about with the visual of the cover is that how do you represent the liminal element of the book, but also kind of try to convey some emotional or like, like the feeling side of things at the same time.
Right.
Um, that can't be easy. So I hadn't thought about that before, but, and now I have to pull down the book because I want to look at it while we're talking about it, but let's see if I, without like falling out of my chair, I should have just had it down, but I wanted it on display for everybody. Um, and like, maybe like, yeah, the feeling of, yeah. And so, um, I think anyway, long story short, I think you landed with a good cover.
Thank you.
Um, and I think that my final thought on that is that I enjoy the symmetry of it.
Thank you. It's interesting too because there's like genre conventions that go into making a cover, and I try to read as widely as I possibly can. And a lot of the cover art that I find like aesthetically pleasing tends to be more in like the literary fiction. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like you were saying before, where sometimes more indie presses can go a little bit more experimental with the cover art, and
Yeah.
then larger presses have to be a little bit more conservative with like what they know works. Um, so instead of sort of like stretching that muscle, I was like, I'm gonna just design a bunch of like freebie assets that I'll give away with
Yeah.
like pre-orders and things like that. So I made like subway tickets and postcards, and I was like,
Oh, wow.
I can be neurotic about graphic design on my own little marketing projects.
There you go. It's best of both worlds then. Yeah. And now like, we're so in the rabbit hole of covers that I'm like, because like one of the comps obviously that comes up is Danielewski's House of Leaves,
Okay.
but it's at the bottom of this pile that I don't want to mess with, so I'm not pulling that out
Two.
because yeah, because like sometimes people give you, oh, you would love this book, and it's like, oh yeah, I read that 12
Mhm.
years ago.
I have two
Um,
copies. One of them is like super well worn in. It has a bunch of annotations. Um,
mhm.
and then one of them is like pristine. I don't touch it. I met him in 2007. I had him sign it. I was like a teenager, and I was like, okay,
Yep.
this stays on my shelf unread.
um, and then I think Susanna Clark's Piranesi was another one, and that was, I mean, that's got much more of a mythology kind of design to the cover of it, but yeah. Anyway, like now I'm thinking about like, what do they do for those? But we could. This is like probably more of a rabbit hole than I expected to go down on the book cover. I just really enjoy the book cover, and it's something that I just sometimes I get so caught up on just going right into the story that I forget to acknowledge, like, yeah, those other little things that make the experience useful and happy and fun, and especially as someone who like looks at like Emily Hughes's like big list of like upcoming horror books, and I I'll read a quick thing, but then I look at the cover and I'm like, okay, yeah,
If
like
a cover
the
is
cover.
like not cute, I'll usually just buy the Kindle version.
There you go.
I'm shallow.
That's a
I do
good,
judge
that's
a
a
book
good,
by its cover, okay?
no, I like it. It's your thing. You do it the way you want to do it. That's what I say. Right?
Right.
Yes. So, the general idea of the story, I'm just going to be jumping all over the place. Apologies, because now my instinct is to dive into talking about the liminal stuff, but like I feel like I want to just get at least acknowledged like the main character and kind of what he's going through in this. So, um, the book opens up where Vicken, am I saying that correctly?
Yep.
Um, has made the decision to end his life by taking the subway to a specific spot, and this is in Montreal, I believe, correct?
Yes.
And then basically drowning in the river, and so that's where we start out. The there's so many thoughts I want to say, and then I'm worried about what I'm going to spoil or not spoil. So we start out with this person who's already made up their mind.
Right.
They know what they're going to do, and they're just on their way to make it happen. And obviously things get in the way, and that creates the story that that we end up reading and everything. And so I guess the first thing that stands out about it is obviously it's from Viken's perspective. And I can't imagine a situation where it isn't like it's a first person. If I'm remembering correctly, it's written first person, correct?
It is. It
Yeah.
had a really different sort of like origin story where it wasn't a first person perspective story at all.
Hmm.
Um, okay, the like, do you want the Cliff Notes version or like extended version?
Give me the one that you want to tell. Yeah.
Okay, so originally when I had set out to write this book, I was contacted by a more like indie genre publisher to write a body horror novella that was like part
Hmm.
of their larger series. And it was going to be with Jess Landry and Nadia Bulkin. And like both of these authors um, had like a body of work that I really admired. And so I was like, okay, body horror, what can I write? What can I write? Um, I started to write this book that was about a group of people who go on an expedition when a like subway tunnel appears at the end of the subway line where it's supposed to end. So they're
Hmm.
like, "Oh, the tunnel suddenly continues. We need to send in like an expedition team to see what's over there." And so it's about this like group of people who go, and each of them is dealing with liminality in their own way. So there's someone who's
Hmm.
dealing with um, the sort of transitional state of being a teenager. There's someone who's dealing with the transitional state of being sick. Someone has just come out of war. And so it's all these different people dealing with transitions in different ways. And um, essentially, I I'm sure we'll get into this later because we had like you and I had noted we were going to like talk about vocabulary, but
Uh-huh.
I'll just sort of like in parentheses. Um, as I was writing this, I was like, oh my God, what I'm writing is, it feels so pretentious because it felt like very big allegorical ideas. Um,
Mm.
and how when these people are in this station, they're sort of being like dissolved by the liminal state that they're in. And the type of language that I was using was like so flowery and so over the top. And I was like trying to deal with a deadline. And I was so frustrated with my own writing that I went to go lie down. I was really frustrated. And then I was like, "Oh, you think you're such fucking hot shit? Like, you're writing this like, allegorical story, and like all horror genre like deals with allegory, from zombies to like haunted houses." And then I opened up a Word document and I just started writing away. That was like this flash chapter that does end up appearing in the book, um, where I was writing it from a character's perspective, talking to me. Um,
Oh,
and then
cool.
it was just like a sort of spiteful backlash on myself as an author. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. So I entirely scrapped this book that was like almost totally completed. I
Wow.
ended up writing a different story for that original like publishing house, and then reworking this like liminal state story into coup de classe, which is like what it is now. So it has this weird sort of like long and weaving origin
Huh.
story, but it was not first person perspective at all. It just turned into that when I was like so tired of rereading the sort of pretentious sounding narrative that I had been writing.
That's that's so funny because in my mind I was like, I can't imagine not writing this from a first person perspective, and so the fact that you struggled with it until it was in the first person is kind of like reinforces the idea that like we really need to inhabit this person and what they're going through in order for it to not just seem you know like a science experiment or something. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. So, yeah, originally when the piece that I had written was with like an ensemble cast, I had all these constraints that I was thinking of when it was for the original call. It had to be like a novella length. It had to include body horror, and then I had a lot of difficulty trying to make these like flesh out full character backstories, and then all of a sudden have everyone's narrative sort of wrap up nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was just listening to your episode with Keith Rawson this morning, who's like a fucking mastermind at ensemble cast.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that books sometimes require the page space. I know he had to add like 30,000 words of
Yeah.
character backstory, which I think really adds to the experience. And it felt like doing this liminal space story with this full ensemble cast as a novella was not letting it shine in the way that it was supposed to. So I sort of like
Mm,
narrowed it down to one of those characters, which ended up being Vicken. And that
yeah.
allowed me to really go deep into like the experience and being inside of his head and not really knowing the space between me as a writer, whoever's reading it as a reader, and him as a narrator.
Yeah. Well, now you've got me thinking about the other kind of liminal type stuff that I've read before.
Mm.
And I feel like most of the time they are pretty solitary stories. So, like, obviously there are other characters that, exist, but like, so from what and if I'm wrong about this, it's because I've read probably 100 books since I read it, but like Susanna Clark's Piranesi, that's a very solitary book, I believe, if I remember correctly.
I need to read it. I haven't read it. I've read
Um,
like the first few chapters, but I need to get the hardback edition because like Back to the
yeah.
Design
Oh my
has
God.
beautiful pillars on it in gold, which I
Yeah.
want to pick
I
up. I can never find the hardcover in stores, so I got to just buy it online.
I definitely. Oh man, I wish I had it close at hand because it is gorgeous. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous book. But and then I feel like House of Leaves again really kind of focuses down to an individual for the most part. Have you read the Rorschach texts?
I haven't, but it was funny when Coup de Classe appeared on Edelweiss, which is like a
Mhm.
website for um, readers and booksellers and librarians to request advanced reader copies. It showed like comp titles, and so it was like House of Leaves, which made sense to me. And then it said the Rorschach texts, and I was like, oh, I guess because it sort of plays with form in a really interesting way.
Mhm.
Um, but I had to add it to my list because I haven't discovered it yet.
So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna just go down that road a little bit because
Do it.
just off camera, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 11 copies of the Rorschach text that I have
Oh my God,
because
me
it's like one of my favorite books. And even someone as a gift, my girlfriend took a copy of it and turned it into like a hollowed out book.
That's so cool. I love
Um,
those. Put a flask in there.
yeah, and like wrote little notes and stuff and put them in there. So um, anyway, there's
It's
a
a bigger book than
whole.
I thought.
It's like 430 pages or something like that. But it reads. I read it on a flight from San Francisco to Chicago. Read it cover to cover, so it reads pretty quickly. Anyway, so there's a whole section of this book about something called unspace, and so the idea of unspace is just like those places in between places. So like, um, uh, the service tunnels underground or anything that's like a space that people don't live in, like they're not like inhabited spaces, is like unspace. And so there's this whole like unspace exploration society thing, and it's like this it's a part that they it's an important plot part in the book, but like the whole idea of there being unspace. And then he kind of turns that into, when he released the book, he wrote an unchapter for every chapter of the book. There's like a corresponding chapter that wasn't in the book that exists somewhere in the world. And
That's cool.
anyway, so there's a definite liminal kind of feel to part of that book. And so, yeah, that's definitely, but it's one person on their mission to do the thing that they have to do. So, um, yeah, I guess kind of that does seem thematic. Like if it's a liminal, if there's a liminal element to a story, it does feel like solitary like a solitary element complements that idea.
Yeah, that makes
Maybe.
sense. When I was thinking about the sort of like influences for this book, there were some literary ones more in terms of an internalization of a character that's like dealing with mental health. But then for more the aesthetic side of it, I kept coming back to just a lot of movies and video games,
Okay.
which is like video games is really where liminal space as an aesthetic I feel has really taken off.
Hmm.
And I think um, single player games sort of lend themselves to that really well. Um, but yeah, things like that, things like SCP. Um, but I was trying to think of, I don't know if you've ever heard about or been to Sleep No More in New York City.
No.
It's like a off Broadway immersive theater experience. I think it's shutting down like this month or next month, but it's been on for like a decade, and it's like 5 stories over 100 rooms in this warehouse. It has like a fictional narrative that it's created where it was this beautiful old hotel called the McKittrick Hotel in like the 1930s that never opened up. It just got like shuttered before it could ever even open, and then it was rediscovered. And so you go in with, I want to say, like 300 other people. Um, and you all have to wear a mask. And then over the course of 3 hours, you're like going through this space, and it's built to be these different spaces that are like a 1930s version of Macbeth meets like Alfred Hitchcock. And it's got elements of Rebecca in it. Anyway, it sounds like a hodgepodge, but as you go in there, you're like surrounded by so many other people, but they force you into isolation. So as you're going in, you go in by groups of maybe like 20. And then let's say you and I were to like go in together, they would open the elevator on like a floor that you don't know. You
Hmm.
would go in, and then they would bar me from following you so that you would be by yourself, to force us apart from each other. So I'm like, oh, it's interesting how liminality seems to work best when we isolate people. I
Yeah.
don't know why that is. I don't know if it's a more like allegorical thing where experiences of transition can feel really isolated, or I don't know. I'm sure there's like much more to chew on there, but when I'm thinking about like influences, that's one that sort of came to mind.
Well, that sounds awesome. And then obviously, like the first thought I have about that as you're explaining it is so many things could go wrong in that situation. Like
Yeah,
so many things.
it's like crazy. People have to. I mean, with that and like with parts of this book and in video gaming, it's almost like you have to sort of railroad people into a limited amount of possibilities,
Hmm.
where it's like
Right.
there's no wrong way to do this, and um, the experience of taking this in is also within like a certain confines, which I
Yeah.
think is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was thinking that once I knew there was a liminal aspect to it, and for anybody who's listening, that happens right away in the book. Like it's very early on in the book. So you're in that very, very quickly in the story. Um, as someone who has to try and talk about stories with people later, I was like, there's no way that I can think about this and not think about what is it an allegory for, an analogy of, or whatever, because that seems like that's almost like its sole purpose is to represent a thing because it's almost so nothing in a way, I guess, if that makes sense. So maybe that's just like psychologically we have no way of not putting some sort of meaning on it or something.
That makes
Um,
sense. I love using space or architecture as allegory for different things. I feel like it's been done, you know, almost ad nauseum in haunted houses. So it's interesting to see when it's sort of turned on its head. I'm thinking of like Ling Hun by Ai
mhm.
Jiang. Um,
Which I have not read, but I've heard about, and it sounds fantastic. Yeah.
so phenomenal and like devastatingly beautiful.
Mhm.
um, and just like haunting. But yeah, I love to see the way that authors or artists can always put new spins on things.
Mhm. So I guess with this book specifically, because liminality does kind of promote us giving a meaning to it in a way, or at least someone can, you know, comment later and tell me I'm wrong about that. But I feel pretty confident that that's pretty commonly a thing. Um, have you thought about what people might put of their own into the explanation for what goes on in the story? Like, like, are you anticipating people having vastly different kind of like reads coming out of it, or do you think they're all going to kind of really come together with a general theme, or have you not thought of that at all?
I haven't thought about it too much so far. Um, it seems to be like what I had in mind is really what people are reading out of it,
Mm-hmm.
or like taking away from it. Um, I do
Where
think
I
that
get
there's, like, you can project different allegories onto the space. Um, but I have like snuck peeks at different reviews, and some people are like, "Oh, well, it's quite ham-fisted that it's about suicidal ideation or like the
right,
liminal state of depression." And I'm like, I'm not trying to hide that that's largely what the framework is.
right. Well, and then as I asked that question, I was thinking it occurred to me that that's probably the what you just said, the suicidal ideation and the depression and everything is probably the conclusion that people come to. But what causes it is maybe where they could bring their own like personal pain into the experience a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, it's been a really, I don't want to say like heartwarming, but like moving experience where certainly there's people that read it and just like do not engage with it at all. This is not the book for them.
Sure.
I'm not sure if the ARC version has this, but the dedication at the start of the book, um, is that this is for people who understand. This is for those who understand. Um,
Yeah, it's in
and
there.
so it was
Yeah.
really meant for folks who have gone through the experience of depression or suicidal ideation. Um, and I guess it's like a really interesting reflection of what they see for themselves, and whether they have hope for themselves. And
Hmm.
um, a lot of the feedback that I've been getting has been a lot of people's really personal experiences with depression.
Yeah.
Um, and that's been really moving and heartwarming to me because it was written from such a like deeply personal space at the time, um, where people are like, "Oh, this is so real. This feels like I'm really there with him," and I'm like, "I was really there with him."
Yeah.
I think
Right.
a lot of writing, to a certain extent, comes from a sort of like self-insert, where you are writing from experience, and this, like, parts of this book definitely did come from that.
Well, and then so that makes me think of first of all, I'm happy that that's the response, like because this is the kind of thing where like people who have gone through it are going to feel maybe seen or understood in a way that they didn't before, possibly. So yeah, that's great that that's the response you're getting. And I was talking with Eric LaRocca with his most recent book, and I had a thought because I was thinking to myself, this is not going to be for everybody all the time. Like the stuff that he writes in general,
Right.
but it's important for people to write those things because sometimes it is going to be like exactly what someone needs. And
Right.
so I feel like maybe that applies a little bit in this situation where, like you said, some people just won't engage with it. But um, if it can be something that really kind of connects with someone in a way that they needed, it's means the world that this exists and is out there for people to have access to. Yeah.
Right. I went to a local book club. It was like the first book club, or like maybe the second book club meeting that I've ever been to. Um, Pride in Montreal is in August for some reason, and so there was a book club meeting in Pride, and we were reading Lou Sullivan, um, Lou Sullivan's diaries. And so I remember one of the people that was at the book club meeting was talking, I think they were quoting someone else who was saying, like, this book is for trans people, everyone else can catch up. And that concept really stuck with me because I think that a lot of the art that we connect with the most, um, you don't have to like connect with everything, but um, the work that does connect with you is what's sort of most important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had found it's so funny. I have rainbow bookshelves around my apartment, but then there is one shelf that I have dedicated to like my favorite reads, and so those are not color coordinated. But then I was looking and I was like, oh my god, so many of these are about suicide, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, what's with that? I think it was because I was like feeling seen in all of these stories, and so there were books that had like spoken to me personally because there was this experience that I was seeing on the page that I wasn't seeing really talked about all that much because I'm sure we'll like get into this a little bit more after, but when it's things that are difficult to talk about, they tend to be sort of hidden away, where we're like, oh, we don't want to engage with difficult subjects. We don't
Mm-hmm.
want to bring up any sort of feeling of trauma in other people. And so we have a tendency to avoid narratives of like sexual assault or suicidality. Um,
Right.
but then it leaves us with a sense that when we're feeling these things or we experience these things, that we're alone. We're the only ones that are going through that. So I do think that it's like important when work like that exists
Yeah.
to be able to talk about it and for it to be able to exist at all. Um, because it allows people to sort of feel seen and not like they're losing their minds.
I have a not exactly the same experience, but I this is totally crazy. So I'm a cancer survivor. I had cancer a few years ago, and my eye doctor had the same type of cancer decades ago. And so it's something that comes up in conversation every time I go to the eye doctor. We kind of chat about what's going on with, how we're doing and everything. And he just said the most random kind of just thing the last time I was in there, just a couple weeks ago, where he just, apropos of nothing, just decided, because this guy went through what I went through, I'm going to say this experience. And he said something about how he felt like the process of going through like chemotherapy and everything was harder on the spouse than it is on the person going through it, because the person going through it, you're so focused on got to do this, then do this, then do this. And it's very like you're very narrowly focused on what's happening, that you don't experience the emotions of it until later.
Right.
And like when he was saying this, I was like, no, I've never heard someone say that exact thing I felt. But the moment he said it, I was like, that's me. Like he said exactly, like it was in my head. And it felt so
Yeah.
good to have someone validate that experience and that feeling that I had that I just didn't have a way of expressing. And so like maybe what you were saying kind of made me feel like that in a way where, uh, yeah, like feeling seen, feeling like I'm not the only person in the world that had that thought or that feeling is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's like also sharing those types of stories, you like open up this capacity for intimacy that wasn't necessarily there before, where all of a sudden you're like seeing each other on a different level.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I don't know,
totally.
I mean, like when you were like talking, it gave me full body goosebumps. It's just like early bittersweet thing, but it's nice when we can have like, obviously you don't want other people to have gone through traumatic experiences, but then trauma can also bond us in a way. I
Right.
don't want to say like trauma bond, but it does like accelerate our capacity for intimacy.
Yeah. It and the feeling I got, exactly what you said, but the feeling I got was validation,
Mhm.
like in a way where it's not something you can expect people to really validate unless they, like if unless they understand like what your dedication in the book was. And so yeah, I guess that's my closest kind of connection to the idea that you had. But it's a very powerful thought or feeling. So yeah, yeah, that's good stuff. I didn't expect to get so personal, but I guess I don't. Maybe I should have kind of exactly what the story is, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I'm going to pivot into something a little bit lighthearted, but we can get back to heavy stuff.
It's okay.
Um,
Party.
because there's so many, and we've already been talking for a while. There's like a lot of other little things. So like there's the liminal element, which I'm sure we're going to explore more. There's the personal motivations and the real serious stuff that we were just talking about a little bit. But there's like other little things, and I'm like I can't not talk about. Um, and so I want to talk about the elevator game. I want to jump to.
Oh.
So I hope it's not a spoiler, but the elevator game is something that comes up in the book, which it's the perfect place for it when someone is kind of lost in this like seemingly endless thing they can't escape. Um, put an elevator in there,
Hmm.
and like the moment realized what was happening in that part of the story, I was so excited. I actually took a picture of the page and I sent it to a couple of friends of mine, and I was like, "You can't escape the elevator game because we talk about it pretty frequently." And so, for anybody who isn't familiar, do you mind kind of explaining really quick what the elevator game is?
Sure. So it was one of those, I guess, internet urban legends that came up where it has like a difficult to trace origin, like a lot of sort of Reddit and 4chan creepypasta type of things. But the version that I found had been translated by someone named Lucia Peters. She has a really excellent book called Dangerous Games to Play in the Dark. And long story short, it's like a bunch of different like adult spooky games that you can play with various risk levels. But for the elevator game, supposedly you're supposed to go into an elevator in a building with 10 floors, and then you press the floors in a certain order. If anyone shows up, the game has to stop, and you have to like leave, and you can come back and try it another time. You have to be completely by yourself to do this. Once you get to the fifth floor, supposedly, a woman is going to come into the elevator, and then if she speaks to you, you're not supposed to speak to her. You're not supposed to look at her. And if you press the 10th floor and the elevator goes down to the first floor, then again, it's null. You're not supposed to do anything. It has not succeeded. You can try it again later. But if it does go up to the 10th floor, you're supposedly in this sort of supernatural other realm where you can go and explore. But you shouldn't lose sight of the elevator in case you lose your tether to your way home. So that's sort of like the basis of it. There's a lot of internet lore that surrounds this, a lot of real life sort of true crime lore that surrounds this as well. Um, but long story short, I wanted something sort of manic to happen in the book, and it very much comes at like the halfway point
Right.
where there's a lot of chapters that are sort of intentionally very verbose and like almost academic, where it's just like there's so much gray and sameness in all the corridors, and Vicken is getting really tired of this, and he's introspecting about the ways that depression can affect the body, the mind, like your ability to like have sex or be horny, your ability to eat or be like nauseous all the time. And then suddenly he comes across this elevator and decides to play this game. And I thought that it was just such a fun sort of representation for the manic state that
Hmm.
we can get into with depression or even like bipolar disorder, where you're doing this sort of up and down and up and down, and like anything at all, even if it's violent, is like exciting. You just want something to be happening in your life that's not depression, where everything that you loved before has been robbed from you.
Yeah.
And so it's him trying to get this reaction out of himself. And then, of course, something external starts to happen, and he's like, oh, fuck. Um, but yeah, hopefully that explains it in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I was so excited. because I had, so in the past I did a different podcast and we were talking about urban legends or something, or it's creepypasta or whatever,
Oh yeah.
and that came up, and I've never been one who believes that type of stuff too much. And so with me and a couple of friends, I was like, I'll do that. You know, I
Have you
will
done
absolutely do that. No, I have not. But
it? Me
like anytime I would do it. Anytime I'm with them though, and we're by like buildings that would qualify,
neither. Right.
even if it's like a big like parking garage, I'm like, let's go. I'll do it right now. And they're like, no, we're not going. And like, they don't want, I know it's just like, we're psyching ourselves up or out or whatever, but,
That was me with Bloody
um,
Mary when I was a kid. I was like, I refuse to do it. And
yeah,
I have a Ouija board. My mother will not let me use it. She's paranoid. She's super superstitious. So
yeah.
anyway, you were saying.
Um, so that's one of the, like, it's such a fascinating idea because like, really there's two possible situations. It's just a story. And
Mhm.
if you were to try it, nothing would happen. And the other end of the situation is you try it, it does what it says it's supposed to do, and you get this oh fuck response of like, oh, I didn't expect it to be real. Now I have to actually engage this
Right.
seriously. And so I was like excited to see how that would play out in the book, and I'm happy with the way that it turned out.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear that. It was like fun to write the very sort of manic
Yeah.
way that chapter unfolds. I love when form tends to follow function. Like I love that about House of Leaves, where like
Hmm.
as Navidson is like crawling through areas and hallways are getting thinner and thinner and thinner, the lines of text get thinner and thinner until you're this like one line of text on each page, and so you're
Yep.
forced to go through this like long experience with him. And I love when text or form is able to reflect the experience that you're supposed to have. So I really wanted it to sort of start off as fun and then go into absolutely manic. And then,
Yeah.
like you said, the oh fuck, what if this is real? Now I got to deal with my consequences to my own decisions.
Right. But yeah, to your point, um, it was kind of the right kind of thing to happen to someone whose psychology up to that point, for like, at least the course of the story, is this kind of endless tedium of being stuck in a place where the worst thing about the place is that it's endless and,
Nothing
you know,
happens.
nothing happens. So the best and worst thing that can happen is anything, like is something.
Right.
So yeah, but like, um, having the character have known about the elevator game and then decide there's an elevator, let's do something. I really, it was for me, have knowing of it in the past, it was very fun.
That's cool. I'm glad that you like knew of it because some people do, some people don't.
Yeah.
Um, it came really sort of by chance. I know, again, this is like so at the forefront of my mind because I was literally listening to this episode this morning, but where Keith Rawson was saying, oh, I just take like six
Yeah.
different things that I like and I mash them together.
Yep.
And a lot of what I write also tends to come from the same sort of place. And sometimes your brain just sort of has an app running in the background of like how things work, but it ended up working really nicely to have that in there.
Yeah.
Because I think elevators have there's something like very modern but also very supernatural about them where there's like a dream logic
Yeah.
where you're in a place and then suddenly you're in a different place. Where like dumb waiters always freaked me out when I was a kid. They seemed too small and sort of coffin like. And then you're like, where do they go? I don't understand. Obviously, they're not meant for people, they're meant for food. But also, what if someone crawled in there? So I think that sort of dream logic opens itself
Hmm.
up to superstitions really well. And then the elevator game and that sort of superstitious quality was like perfect.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm glad that you liked it.
Well, and the whole thought of like an elevator takes you somewhere totally different. And what does that mean in a place like this? Like, so yeah, like, yeah, there's that
Yeah, because
element.
it ends up there's only like 10 floors on the elevator, and he's like, this isn't really a spoiler, but he sort of scoffs because he's like, obviously, there's not 10 floors to this place. I've
Right.
been walking here for days. And then when it sort of drops him off, you're in like the sub level basement
Yep.
like who knows how many like tens of thousands of feet underground. And you're like, how do I get back out of this? Like, how do I find my way out from here?
Yeah.
Um,
And like it contributes to the mind fuck, and it's like every action you take, can you go back from? That's my biggest thing. Can I get back to what I was doing before?
right.
Is it would be my personal fear is like, is this a one way situation? And or have I reached the level of hopelessness where I don't care if this isn't what, like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like is my psychology so messed up that like anything is better than, you know, anything new is better than the same old shit or something. So yeah, it just the presence of an elevator introduces such interesting thoughts in a situation like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's like interesting too when you were saying, oh, your like ability to backtrack. I was thinking about the way that I play like video games comparative to like my partner, for instance. He's like super completionist. We were playing this game the other day, and he was like, "Oh, well, like click over here and don't forget to talk to this person." And I'm usually like, "What's the task? Give me like a glowing bar, like telling me where to go, and I'll just do it." Um, but then there's the sort of concept of choice that comes into play, where you're like, if you're railroading something, you're missing other potential events happening. And no matter what, even if you do sort of like go and meet everyone, well, I guess in Coup de Glace and in a couple of other liminal spaces, the intent is that it's so big that you couldn't possibly ever
Yeah.
explore all of the possibilities,
Hmm.
which makes it feel kind of all that much more dreadful because you're like,
Hmm.
no matter which way I'm choosing to go, I'll never know whether or not it's the wrong way unless something bad or something good happens.
Yep. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And
But
like, you don't even know, like, because how does reality dictate what's going on? Is my exploration making it be like, fuck you, there's more now, or something like that? Like, there's
right,
no,
you're just like unlocking an entire fucking DLC of like
you,
other
you
rooms. Yeah.
can't, you can't understand the internal logic of, if there is internal logic of whatever it is you're trapped in or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Um, yeah, that's good stuff. um, use of language came up, and so like what I didn't. I'm going to pause and say, early on in this podcast, I talked to Cassandra Kaw, and I know I dropped that name a couple of times when I was communicating with you off the podcast. And one of the things I love about their writing is how um, I'm trying to think of expansive the language that they use is, and I found that this was pretty similar. And I guess what I wasn't aware of was whether that was the way you write or if it was specific to the story. But like I would read, um, I'd be like sitting reading next to my girlfriend, and I'd say, "Can I read you something?" And I would just read out a paragraph, because some of it's really dense. Some of it is, I wrote down two words. So dense, there's like some dense use of kind of big or heavy words in some points, but also I felt like consistently throughout the whole story, it's a very poetic, like, style of writing. And so um, for me, yeah, again, didn't know if that was just your style or if it was like intentional for the book. And you kind of alluded to it has to do with Viken's situation and everything. But I feel like that was better than like a stark and stripped down type of writing, especially in such a stark and stripped down environment,
Right.
you know? So, did you intention, I guess, because I've been talking for like 4 minutes now setting up this question, um, was it just intentional for Viken's experience, or was it something that you kind of tend to write that way anyway?
Um, I think it's like a mix of both. It's been interesting to write more and more as I get older. A lot of the writing that tends to appeal to me the most is more in the sort of literary fiction genre. Um, and so a lot of where I learned to write comes from a patchwork quilt of
Hmm.
those writers. Um, and I do think that there's a lot of people that sort of straddle genre and more literary poetic prose really well. I'm thinking about like Joe Kosh, um, who writes the most like hallucinogenic stories. Kathy Koja, like you had mentioned, Cassandra Caw. Cass used to live in Montreal, and
Mm. Oh, cool.
we would like hang out from time to time. Their writing style is definitely like a very big influence, and had unlocked a lot of um, like possibilities in writing that I didn't even know that you could do, just like verbing a noun. And
Oh, uh-huh. Yeah.
there's all these writing conventions that you learn, and then there comes to a point where you're like, I need to discard what doesn't serve me and doesn't serve the story.
Right.
And so definitely it is a mix of like the influences that I've had and what I enjoy reading. I also, every time that I read a word that I haven't learned before, I'll screenshot it on my phone, or I have like, there's a website called vocabulary.com. It's fantastic. Um, you can make lists. And so I have lists going where it's like architecture words, medical words, like
Oh,
celestial
awesome.
words. And so it's really interesting to go and revisit that. And they contextualize words in really wonderful ways because they'll pull from classics and say, like, you want to use this word, here's how it is in 15 different sentences, so that you're not misusing a word. Um, so it's like a mix of those things. And then, like I had mentioned before, with like, oh, the form following function, I do find that I've done that more than once. There was a short story that I wrote called The Roses of Heliogabalus, which is like inspired by this painting of this Roman emperor Heliogabalus who, in the painting, he like unleashes like thousands of rose petals, and there's a sort of orgy of people that are like high out of their minds on opium, drowning in this ocean of roses. And so I was like, what if I took that to its national conclusion and they did actually drown in a like sea of petals? Um, but everything in that story I wanted to write with opulence, and so everything was described as like so over the top poetic. And then I feel like in Coup de Glace it's really similar, where there's like a natural lull where it's complex and engaging, but it's also academic and sort of boring in some senses because that's like what you can feel. And so I know that there's this like early middle bit of chapters that can feel very verbose.
Hmm.
But I do think that that's sort of intentional. And I don't know that I've written enough to know whether or not that's only going to be in this book. I'm like, I'm curious to find out because now that you've asked me, I'm like, I'm not sure. But it's
That's
been
interesting.
interesting to see people's
Yeah.
reviews and be like, oh, like Cassandra Caw's name comes up a lot where it's like, did Sophia jerked off with a thesaurus? I'm like, okay, well, I don't know, go read some books. um, but I know it's not going to be for everyone. But I sort of wrote for myself first and foremost, and I love learning
Oh,
new
yeah.
words. And so hopefully it doesn't feel as though it's over the top and forced. And then it has intention because I wrote it in a way that I felt it did.
Hmm. Well, a couple of thoughts. First of all, going back to when I was explaining that I had walked for coffee earlier and I had thought about my little preamble and how it sounded perfect in my head. And when I actually said it out loud, it sounded much more clunky. We're in Vicken's head. And
Mhm.
so, like, we're not restrained by the translation from brain to mouth. Like,
Right.
so I feel like being a little bit more verbose or poetic or dense probably maybe accurately reflects what it would be like to just be in your own head. So that's one thing. Did I forget the second one? Might have forgotten the second one. Um, oh well, but that one was good.
It's interesting because going back to when I had originally written this for a different call, this version I did end up submitting to that publishing house, and then they had an editor come on board and read it. And then I got
Mhm.
an email from the owner of the publishing house, and they were like, The editor really did not like this. He said that he would stop reading about 30 pages in, um, if like he wasn't an editor. And so he has some thoughts, and we think that you should revise them and then have your like writing colleagues basically beta read this. And this was one of the first projects that I had like ever worked on. And so I was really like taken aback and sort of
Yeah.
heartbroken initially when I was reading his notes, because they started off fine and then they sort of like delved into a rage, like a haze of anger, where the editor started off and he was saying like, this isn't a word, this isn't a word, this isn't a word. And I was like, oh, but they absolutely are. I'm not making up words. And so I was like going and double checking, and I'm like, no, it is, it is. Um,
Oh no.
and then he was like, I don't understand why you're using all these like complex medical terms. Because there is a chapter where he's talking about like going to cognitive behavioral therapy and like taking SSRIs and taking
Right.
SNRIs and just like being thrown a medley of different solutions that don't work. And I wanted it to feel overwhelming, where it's like, you know, when you have like
It's
a
kind of the point,
headache or
right?
a nosebleed, and like I deal with migraines. And so I'll tell people like, oh, I have a migraine. And then they're like, have you tried like, I don't know,
Hmm.
pinching this like nerve in your hand, or like have you tried this herb? And I'm like, believe me when I say I've been dealing with this for like 15 years of my life. Everything possibly imaginable I have tried. And so everyone thinks that there's sort of an expert on it, when you are really the expert of your own body when you're dealing with trauma or pain. And so I wanted this sort of like inexhaustible amount
Yeah.
of medical terms to be thrown at you. But anyway, the editor's comments basically devolved into being like, I'm no longer commenting on story. This is incoherent. I don't understand why you have to use all these flowery words. Why are you saying crimson when you can just say red? And I was like, because I want to. I don't know how else to explain it. Um, that just means that it's not necessarily for you. And so
Yeah.
I ended up pulling the book because I was like, it doesn't feel like it's written for this specific audience. Um, I have more sort of like commercial books or commercial stories in me, but this one, it felt like it would be a compromise to like change the language somehow.
Uh, that's doesn't sound like that was the right editor to be looking at that manuscript at all.
Mm.
Because I would imagine, not being an editor myself, but like one of the things that you're trying to do when you're reading someone's writing is understand what they're going for. Like,
Right,
what are they trying to do with this? And so, like the medical terms that you mentioned, I remember that part. And when I read that, I'm just a reader. I'm not a professional editor. I'm not a writer. But I've read a lot and I think about writing a lot. What I got from that part of the story was, oh, this I don't understand, but I bet you someone else who's reading this is going to know exact, like they're going to be taken back to a specific time in their life where they
right,
dealt with that. And so I was, even though I didn't personally connect with that, I saw what you were trying to do. And that told me, oh, this is, it's important that it has to be this way. So even just as like a lay person who didn't understand those specific things,
right.
I got what you were going for. So it's kind of insane that this I'm just gonna say, because so you don't have to, this not so good editor um didn't really get what you were trying to do with that. It's that's too bad.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that like ultimately the editor that I ended up working with at Titan fully understood and wanted to champion this story. Like,
Uh-huh.
there's a chapter early on where it talks about the subway system sort of unfolding from
Yeah.
itself, from like a pinprick needlepoint, and just like unweaving. And he had left a comment in the manuscript originally, and here's like, this chapter is when I knew that I wanted to sign you. And I was like, oh, that meant so much to me, because it was like, again, when we were talking about experiences or being seen, it was like, oh, this has found its
Yep.
people.
Hmm.
This has found someone who doesn't want to change it or hide away those elements that are maybe more complex and more challenging, that
Hmm.
really wants to like elevate it. Um,
They
so I
appreciate
feel
it.
really lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. For anybody who's listening or watching, I know you just released a video of you reading that part on social
Yes.
media. So follow Sofia on social media, and you can see because it is, but like it also kind of is illustrative of kind of a bigger idea, and so yeah, it's a very important part of the book. Um, so I'm glad that great that you found the right editor and the right team to champion the story. Um, One of the things that I like about I'm going to go back to Cassandra Khan really quick is they seem just so I don't know if it's real confidence, but it just feels like Cassandra feels like this is exactly what this needs to be. Um, so like it didn't feel like you need like there's any reason to challenge it. Like like this is what it is. Like this is what it's meant to be, and this is how it's meant to be said. And I like that so much about Cassandra. And maybe there is insecurities that I'm not seeing, but like there's a confidence to the way that Cassandra's writing comes off that I think is great. And I felt that similarly with this. And so I'm glad that you weren't made to compromise things in this the way that maybe some, loser editors may have made you try to do.
Thank you. Yeah. Cassandra's work is so rich with like imagery and metaphor and language. Every time I go through, I'm like relearning new words or new terms of phrase, and nothing about it is rote and nothing about
Yeah.
it feels cliche. It's all new and original. And I love discovering work like that because it just
Yeah.
lets you see the possibilities of what can happen in writing. And I think a lot of poetry also challenges convention and challenges language and the way that we pair images together. Um,
Hmm.
so it was almost more of a challenge to myself to be like, can I do this in prose?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it makes the project more exciting.
I remembered the second thing that I was going to say earlier, so I'm just going to get it out real quick. It's a real quick one though. Is this having taken place in Montreal? Was there any concern for us dumb Americans that there would be some Montreal or Canada or like French Canadian kind of stuff that was going to get lost in the not translation, but like lost in not understanding things?
Well, there's like two things that come to mind. The first one, if I go back to like that previous editor that I had initially worked with, I do mention a DEP, which is like a dépanneur in Montreal is like the equivalent of a bodega. It's like a corner store
Hmm.
that you find in cities. You can buy fruit, and it's almost like a gas station store. Um, and so those appear in a lot of subway stations here. Um, and so initially, when I had that written in there, the editor was like, "Why are you using this word?" And I was like, "That's what we call it here. It's based here. It makes the most sense to use that word because it's accurately describing what that is." And then the architecture of the underground subway system here, I think, is really unique. Um, and very different from like the New York City public transit system, um, or like some in Europe or in East Asia. And so I wanted to be sure that I described to the best of my capabilities what that
Hmm.
looks like, because it is like these insane underground cathedrals that are just
Yeah.
immense. And like even if you capture it on your phone, it like doesn't do it justice. It's almost like you need the banana for scale. It's just like we shouldn't
Right.
be this far underground. It feels like dream logic. And yeah, it's such a strong part of like Montreal's history, and each station has its own flavor. Each station sort of had its own architect. Um, and it's, I don't know, it was like interesting to me, and it's maybe a little bit of a love letter to the city,
Hmm.
because it's, even when I didn't live here, it would like show up in my dreams where I'd be in these
Oh
like
wow.
crazy underground spaces that would be enormous, and then an earthquake would hit and it would like collapse and we'd be trapped inside. Um, and so, yeah, one of the fun things was I had discovered this animator on TikTok. His name was Chris McAllister. He was doing these renderings of liminal spaces. And so I reached out to him. This was like last year, right when I learned that I had a contract. Even before then, I was like, hey, I wrote a book. It's not signed or anything yet, but I would love to work together on like a trailer or video if you're open to commission. And then he was, and I was sending him videos and photos of the Montreal subway system. And he ended up creating this trailer, which is like on my website. It's on my Twitter. It is so cool. And I was like, oh, he captured perfectly what that looks like. Um,
That's awesome.
and so it was cool to see it sort of translated um, from writing to visual, from like reality to animated and all that.
That's I was talking to my girlfriend about this book. She has to endure everything I read. So I had mentioned that, it takes place in Montreal and it's in the, the subway and everything. She's like, "Oh, I've been there. Those are amazing," or something like that. So like, had she read this book, she would have had a perfect visual in her head of like her experiences, which is pretty cool. Can we talk about body horror?
Hell yeah.
So there are moments in this story that get gory or gruesome or weird, and I'm assuming. I guess I shouldn't assume. Are the things that happen in here that are kind of more leaning toward body horror, um, kind of echoes of what the original story was thinking about, or is this just new for this iteration of the final kind of thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. It was a little bit of both. There's definitely a bodily element to depression where it's this like thing that's happening in your head, but then it sort of manifests in the body in different ways. Um, where again, if you have nausea and then you either are overeating or eating things that would be deemed unhealthy for you or not eating at all. And I had experiences like lapsing repeatedly throughout my life with like self-harming. And so what was written in the story definitely came from that place. And then
Mm-hmm.
trying to see like if you're feeling nothing for so long, sometimes you'll do anything to feel something. Again,
Right.
that's reflected in like the elevator game sequence, but it's also reflected in Vicken trying to carve into himself. And then he also uses it as a sort of way to keep track of where he is, almost like creating maps. Um, and then there's this belief that he has of if he's in this space for so long, then the concrete that comes to make the architecture is somehow like manifested inside of him and is growing inside of him, and that's where
Yep.
that heaviness and that grayness comes from, and that ability to sink comes from. And so he's not sure if he wants to carve it out or if it'll go away on its own. And that was really inspired by Scott Smith's The Ruins. I loved how he did the sort of weird creeping paranoia in that book where
Mm-hmm.
there's like a character that maybe has vines inside of him and he gets so paranoid about whether or not they're growing that he starts just sort of like cutting at himself manically. And I think that's like reflected in the movie adaptation as well, where you're not sure whether or not that's what's actually there, or is it
Yeah.
sort of like moving around and has its own consciousness and is skirting away from you, or are you losing your mind? But yeah, it was very much intentional to have the body horror elements. And they also sort of are reflected in there's these sort of salt pillar people that appear in the
Yeah.
space. Because it's nice to have an added external threat.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I like to have a sense of visiting a space and then it having some sort of history. And I think liminal space often has that where you feel like you're going somewhere that has just been like deserted. And so you're in a place that you're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
So you're like, you're in someone's house and then there's, the smoke coming off of an ashtray. So someone was just there. Are they going to come in and find out that you're there? And so I wanted the space to have these remnants of something that had happened that was there before Vicken got there. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, is that what's going to happen to me? Where are these things? Are there more of them in this space? So it adds like a nice
Yeah.
little threat.
Yeah, because at the very beginning, you're thinking, is this something that just happened? Was this something that came about specifically for Vicken, or is this something that Vicken stumbled upon somehow?
Mhm,
And so, yeah, like there's another character, Pashmina,
mhm.
that that answers that question right away. Like Vicken's not the only person that's in this situation, but then the question is like, how long has this been going on? Who else? Like, like
Right. How
what
big is
other
this
what?
place even?
How big is it? What you know? Is it is it harmless? Is it dangerous? Yeah. So I think that the existence of Pashmina almost seems more dangerous because for sure like other people have had to endure whatever is in the future for Vicken. So like it just promises things could get pretty crazy, whereas like if it was just Vicken, you never know. um, so yeah, I thought that was probably a good move to throw someone else or something else, like you were saying, in the mix to kind of just raise more questions about what's going on.
Yeah. There's a sort of like vicarious nature to violence where you're like, oh, there's this horrible thing that's happened, but like, thank God it didn't happen to me, even though you don't
Yeah.
want these things to happen to anyone. Um, you get to sort of like experience it through them experiencing it, but then that's a whole other level of horror.
Hmm.
Um, I'm thinking of there was this building, I want to say it was in maybe Miami a couple of years ago, and there's footage of it. It just collapsed.
Oh yeah.
Um, and it's such a short clip, but it is so horrifying. Um, because you obviously put yourself in that experience of like, how can this happen so quickly? What were those people thinking right before this happened?
Hmm.
I want to say that there was one family that like by chance got out like
Yeah.
a couple of seconds or even minutes before it happened, and then saw this whole thing collapse. And then it introduces this whole element of like survivor's guilt, where it was like, what if? And now does my life have so much more weight because I'm the one who has survived this?
Yep.
Um, so I think having an extra person within these sort of like fictional narratives, it helps to add an element of dread.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. And you're kind of defined by. Well, I guess those people that got out are kind of defined by that moment of like now they're just the folks that survived this
Right.
building collapse instead of being whatever they were before or whatever. So it
Yeah.
does fundamentally change the whole story for them. Yeah. Um, One thing I want to acknowledge right now is that we've been talking for I've been recording for like an hour and 20 minutes, and this book, we didn't mention it before, is the book ends 136 pages. So like we've been talking for almost 90 minutes about something that is 136 pages long, which means there's a lot going on. It has a lot of stuff that's very like noteworthy, but I think that that's the testament to a good story is like it makes you think and it makes you connect to the things and experiences in your life. I'm going to pause because sometimes people write books just for entertainment, and that is great too. Um, but when we have something that speaks to us in a way that we can like talk and think about it so much, I think that that's one of my favorite things about books is like when it makes us go into ourselves, but also maybe think about, you know, um, bigger things in general. So that's me acknowledging this book is, we could probably go for another 2 hours talking about stuff in the book. And I've probably trimmed down the amount of time we spent on certain topics just because I didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to talk about some stuff. All right. So for anybody who's listening who has not checked out this whole after party thing, and you're okay with spoilers, we just had an incredible conversation about some of the more spoilery stuff in the book. So if you're into that kind of thing, it's, it's available. Go to my website and you'll see what to do about that. But in general, this book made me think and feel a lot of things, and this conversation made me think and feel way, way bigger things. And I think in general, it's a fantastic story. And I'm so excited that I got a chance to talk to you about it. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And I'm pre-pressuring you for whatever comes out next to come back on. But thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you more so for creating such a compelling and beautiful story.
Thank you. I'm really excited that we got to talk, and your support in all of this has really meant a lot, like especially from sort of day one, and being a new author to the game. It's really nice to have these kinds of discussions, especially when I have the context of like getting to watch your show and seeing the discussions that you're having, and that you like bring that same energy to the conversation that we had is really nice.
Oh, well, I will point out for anybody listening that in addition to the support that I have shown, people like Becky Spratford, Daniel Kraus, Josh Mallerman, Kathy Koja, Cassandra Kaw, Eric LaRocca, Paul Tremblay, Nat Cassidy, Cynthia Palaio, Haley Piper, Gemma Amore, and then I just wrote everyone. There's a lot of people who have said great things about this story, and I know that that's just people saying stuff, but like that's a lot of people who have a lot of good stuff to say about this. So if this conversation didn't do it for you, there's a ton of other folks that are saying such good things about this book, and that should push you over to the point where you order it, because that's exactly what you should do right now.
Thank you. The horror community is like amazing. Honestly, people have been so supportive, and it's been such a delight.
Yeah. Well deserved.
Thank you.